So I'm third, yeah?
You're very funny. You are watching or listening to Strangers in Space, and for the next 60 minutes, if we can make it that far, we are going to be talking about the trial of the Time Lord, so you don't have to. Hi, I'm JR.
I'm John.
And I'm Matt.
And so the vote for this was very close. We got 100% vote for the story called The Trial of the Time Lord, and nobody voted for anything else. So that about wraps that up. Next time. Okay, maybe not. John, your first time on one of these season polls.
It is.
I think I'd better explain, because this has been happening and people are probably aware it's happening, but I don't think we've actually stopped to say what and why. Because obviously Lee, for the last year or so, has been very busy and he's missed a lot of episodes, and it looks like he's probably going to continue to be busy, so he can't be relied upon to be here regularly. Simon, similarly, wants to... I think, given the amount of film club stuff we've been doing, I've been piling the pressure on Simon a bit. So I think Simon would like to just back away slightly from the feed, so that he still be a regular, but just be less regular than he is at the moment, because, yeah, I do think I've put the pressure on him. And I also think having a couple of extra faces around takes the onus off Matt and me too, to always be there, even for things that we don't necessarily want to be. Now that we've introduced the music club strand as well, it means that there's an awful lot going on our feed, which I think is great. But the same four voices talking about all four of those things, when it doesn't necessarily mean that all four of us will be interested in those four things. Having two extra voices just enables us to keep things ticking over without things getting dull or without things stretching so far that it starts to become problematic. So to that end, and because John and Mark had both been around on podcasts recent to this development, I asked John and Mark if they'd like to become more regular members of the podcast team. And here's John in your first sort of regular slot. So welcome aboard, John.
Thank you. I won't mention the blackmail it took to bring me aboard at all, but...
But people on the video, if you look very carefully in the background, no.
Shh.
Trial of a Time Lord, then. I'm going to go through the listener comments, the general comments, the ones they made about the season as a whole. And then we'll have a bit of a chat about it ourselves, and then we'll get stuck into the stories such as they are. And we have, of course, divided them in the as traditional fashion of 4-4-4-2. Phil Markham says, mixed bag of stories throughout. It was a bold attempt at the season-long arc ahead of its time. It would have been more interesting if we had had the original episode 14. Also, the opening sequence still holds up to this day. Ian Martin says, I loved this on broadcast, but 10 years of listening to Doctor Who podcasts and rewatching all of Doctor Who from 1975 onwards really leads to the inescapable conclusion that this is a really tough season to watch. Better than season 22, though, and Michael Jaston remains unbelievably excellent. David Ewan says, a really bold and interesting season, but was a trial a good idea after 1985? It is the story of the death of a genius writer and two key members of the production team at complete loggerheads. Off-screen drama being more interesting than that on-screen, perhaps. And Ian Charles, on the other hand, says, the concept of this season I actually like, but it was poorly executed and the ending didn't land due to the obvious reasons. Terror of the Vervoids is the only one that really gets pass marks from me. We'll talk about whether a trial was a good idea. I think we'll start with that once we get through the comments, because that's probably the most interesting question of them all. Rod Brown says, such an oddity. Far more than Nikita Time, this year has the clearest and possibly strongest framework of any classic season. Yet it is so evident that the trial storyline was woefully underdeveloped, resulting in a garbled premise, ever-shifting motives, and a tacked-on ending. But despite this, there is stuff to love. The look, mood, music, and atmosphere of Mind Warp are superb and raise it higher than it probably deserves, and Vervoids is solid stuff. But overall, this has to be judged as a failed experiment. Conversely, Flux was also made in a period of huge external pressures, yet provided much richer pickings. Steve Cunniff says very hard to rank them, as they are all of a very poor standard. Mind Warp is third because it's Mind Warp is third because it's impossible to tell whether the Doctor is behaving in good faith or not, and the cruelty to Perry is just awful. Vervoids is fourth because it is even worse. The Baker's dialogue is undeliverable by any actor, and the characters are cliched and wooden. Overall, a season I would rather not have been made. The abysmal season 22 looks like the work of an avant-garde genius by comparison. This is going to be a fun conversation, isn't it? Matthew Maisie says, doesn't quite reach anything great, but I don't think it's quite as terrible as people often say. The programme did need the change, and it's a shame that things had to get as troubled behind the camera as they did. Alistair Thwaite says just 2 points about this season. 1. Pity poor Bonnie Langford for being given this line to say, I'm as truthful, honest, and about as boring as they come. Your new companion, ladies and gentlemen. Point 2. Before the War Doctor and the Fugitive, we have the original unnumbered Doctor, the Valeyard, yet he doesn't seem to count anymore. That's true, actually. He does get forgotten a bit these days, doesn't he? And yet he's the only sort of classic series attempt to do something that the new series has now done twice. Adric Marks says, as usual, everyone, especially those over the age of 35, treats Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy's eras as punching bags, but to us, rare few, the Baker and McCoy eras were some of the best and most creative. Personally, I find this better than Flux was this year, the only downside being the treatment of Perry, of course, but it is still chilling stuff and the whole season was well done. And again, I am extremely prepared to be in the minority here, and he's not wrong.
Did he say people? So for people over 35, Baker and McCoy are punching bags. The punching bags.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Because I think he's not wrong. People who grew up with Colin Baker and Sylvester McCoy tend to be a lot more favourable towards them. And Sylvester McCoy, in particular, apparently is very popular with kids and that these days.
Absolutely.
So yeah.
Son's favourite, or one of them. So
yeah,
and one of mine actually, because that might bias him a little. So
absolutely.
I just think he's a bit off with his age.
Maybe
so,
40
so I grew up with Baker and McCoy, and I'm a little bit older than 35 now.
Yeah, maybe you're right, but the gist of what he says, I think, bears weight. Jimmy Twizzle, only 2 more. Jimmy Twizzle says, if watched quickly in a single sitting or across, say, 2 days, this would not be as bad as many say. The courtroom scenes eventually become too obtrusive, but I feel sorry that Colin could never show the Doctor he has shown since in the Big Finish productions, or indeed the Doctor he asked to be in the first place. And Tim Ullman, who generally speaking pretty much nails the way I feel about it, says, having missed most of his original tenure as the Doctor, I had readily accepted the conventional wisdom that Colin Baker was the wrong actor in the wrong series at the wrong time. But having finally got round to seeing his era not so long ago, I actually found his performance quite charming. Most of the stories were rubbish, though. This series was no exception. Why the production team ever thought it was a good idea to put this season up as a hostage to fortune with this title and format when the show itself was in such peril is beyond me. It's cheap, tatty and uninspired. How it ever got recommissioned for a few more years after this is a mystery. That is the comments, for what it's worth. John, I'm going to ask you, before I ask you whether you enjoyed the Trial of a Time Lord season or what bits of it necessarily you might or might not have enjoyed, do you think, because at least 3 people brought it up, do you think it was right to do a season in which Doctor Who the programme was doing a fictional trial as Doctor Who the programme was on trial for its very life was a wise idea?
It's kind of tempting fate, isn't it, really? It's kind of saying, with your viewers, you can go, yes, guilty, there you go, switch off. And the series,
and basically they did.
Yeah. Because they didn't even tune in for that first shot. Yeah, that first shot is undeniably probably the best effect shot in the whole of the original series. But yeah, it's kind of okay. We're going to have one story over 14 weeks is what it's sold as, and what without the viewers who know the production codes, etc. You see part 1 of 14. People don't stick around for long stories. They tend to lose viewers over time. So I'd say it's a terribly unwise story. They couldn't have predicted what happened with Robert Holmes, what was going to happen with Eric Saywood at the end of the season. So Yeah, I can't say it's a good idea at all for my money on that front.
I think it would have been a brilliant idea if they pulled something really brilliant out of the hat.
Yeah,
So I think,
it
needed
something
to be good.
unexpected, didn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. If they could have said to the audience, Doctor Who is on trial for its very life, and so is Doctor Who in the series itself, and then produced this first episode that made everybody go, wow, what's going to happen? Then, yeah, that would have been brilliant. Hook in an audience for 14 weeks and get the audience to build across the 14 weeks. But you needed something that was, of the ilk of Genesis of the Daleks. Genesis of the Daleks had the kind of conceit at the heart of it, the Davros character. Even if the story had been rubbish, people would have tuned in to find out what the Davros storyline was all about. Trial of a Time Lord, you tune into the first episode and you get Katrika and Glitz and Dibber, and that is not anything like the conceit of Davros, and there's just nothing there to make an audience want to stick around. That to me is the problem.
Yeah, there's no moral weight, is there, to the stories? That's what you probably need in a trial story to make you actually question the Doctor's actions.
But also, every time the Valeyard turns around and says, "Oh, things have escalated," as an audience member, you're thinking, "Oh God, really?" Matt, sorry, you were.
Well, I think the idea of the trial being an issue, coincidentally, because the series is on trial, I think that's been overstated over the years. I think it is a coincidence. I doubt it had much of an impact. I think their problem, as you're suggesting, is that they take the idea of a trial too literally and create this incredibly undynamic situation of an actual courtroom. Whereas if they'd done what Next Generation, Star Trek Next Generation had Q in All Good Things, putting Picard and the human race on trial and doing these kind of magical things of sending him back and forth in time and exploring things, and it's all a bit weird. If they'd done something a bit more interesting, more dynamic, and actually John Nathan Turner's always been accused of kind of pandering to the sort of nostalgia gene of the fandom and bringing elements back from the past. And this is the one series where he doesn't do that, but the actual setup is perfectly attuned to that. Evidence from the Doctor's past. So put Colin Baker in some sort of story put him in the story with Patrick Troughton, or this is where the two Doctors would actually fit in.
Or put him in Genesis of the Daleks.
Or put him in Genesis of the Daleks. But instead you get quite refreshingly new stories with no references. So that's good. But in this one context, they kind of needed that. Four stories, they needed kind of a hook.
Or something along the lines of, in the first story, the Doctor arrives in the trial to find his future self on trial, runs away, tries to avoid the trial, and the story of the season is the adventures the Doctor gets caught up in as the Time Lords are trying to catch up with him, chasing him across the universe throughout time and space to bring him back to the trial to be his future self that he sees on trial in the opening scene. Something like that.
You can escalate your charges then as well,
Yeah.
Absconding. Yeah.
Having said all that, and maybe I'll wait until we talk about Mysterious Planet. When do we talk about Mysterious Planet, JR?
Well, I'm not going to say.
Spoilers.
I mean, the four stories have come in within the middle third of the voting. So there's nothing above 67% and there's nothing below 33%. All four stories are squashed right into the middle of the voting. So there wasn't a lot to choose between them for all our listeners. There is one that's rock bottom and the three above it are a little bit above, but there's not a massive amount even between the one that's bottom and the other three. But I mean, let's just, before we get into the stories themselves, John, did you enjoy it? Do you remember watching it as a kid, and did you enjoy it?
I do remember watching it as a kid, primarily because it was there was one episode, part 8. So obviously, last episode of mine, I watched that at my grand's, and it's the one time any member of my family has made a comment on Doctor Who, and it was, "This is horrible. I don't like it."
Wow.
I think the big issue really with it is it's not a big enough break from the previous season. We said they want to tone down the violence. They want to, bring up the humor. And, in the first story, you've got Katrika coming out with streaks of blood on her face. You've got then you've got obviously Perry getting her brain wiped. It's not the series you need at this point. You need something different. I don't think it actually had that much of a chance because BBC's one's lineup that year bombed, as I recall. You had, was it Roland Rat? The series came on as a hook in, and it just absolutely fell dead in the water.
Yeah.
You had Blind Date opposite it, just annihilated it. So
Yes.
we can talk about the creative flaws, but I think it was on hiding to nothing from the start, almost in the same way it would be against Coronation Street later on.
Do you know, this is the first series of Doctor Who I didn't watch on broadcast.
Ooh.
I hated season 22. I really didn't get along with it. And when I did, and I was as upset, I suppose, in a way, as anybody else when I heard that Doctor Who was cancelled. Because the thing about Doctor Who is you always hope, even when you're not enjoying it, that the next year you will, that,
Yes.
it'll have turned around. So I always hoped that. And I was hoping that season 23 might be something different. But as we were coming to, I was still reading Doctor Who magazine. As we were coming towards season 23, and the same names were still involved, Sayward and John Nathan Turner, and it's going to be a trial. It's going to be 14 episodes comprising, one story comprising 14 episodes, the whole season. And I just looked at it and I thought, oh my God, I found it hard enough to get through 2 episodes of Revelation of the Daleks, 14 episodes in a row of the Doctor on trial, as written and produced by Sayward and John Nathan Turner. And I couldn't face it. And you know what? Not to spoil things too much for where this conversation is going to go, and people will have heard me say this before, I would imagine anyway, if they're regular listeners on the feed. About halfway through, I tuned in out of curiosity to the first episode, I think, of Terror of the Vervoids, and I actually thought, oh, this isn't too bad, and I stuck around for the rest. So it was actually only the first 2 stories that I missed on broadcast and caught up with, I don't know, on videotape a couple of years later or something. Matt, what about you? Are you old enough to remember this from broadcast? You are.
Yeah,
right?
I've been watching since Davison, but this was the last series broadcast before I started recording off the telly. So I started with Trial of the Time Lord, and so the McCoy years I watched and rewatched until the tapes ran out. So I know that.
Yeah.
So this was kind of, I really liked this when I watched it on broadcast. I was just about the right age. I didn't find Mysterious Planet particularly scary, but from Mind Warp onwards, there were moments that really stuck with me and really terrified me. Mind Warp, yeah, Perry's brain getting washed, but Perry going furry and turning into a bird really freaked me out. The Vervoids killing people with darts into the palms of their hands.
Terror of the Vervoids has got 2 great cliffhangers.
Yeah,
really, especially for kids. Yeah,
and Ultimate Foe freaks me out as well. So I was probably the perfect age for this, and it worked.
But Ultimate Foe is Deadly Assassin for people who were born 10 years later, right?
Yeah. So at the time originally watching it, I couldn't see any flaws. I was happily watching it. I think I understood that something was slightly off with it because my older brother was telling me how it wasn't as good as it used to be. So I kind of started absorbing that knowledge through him. But from what I remember, I didn't have any problems watching this. I didn't have any problems watching the videotape when it was released. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan, but it worked for a 9-year-old.
Yeah, we'll get into that, but I think that is probably the story of it. I think if you were the right age for it, it would work perfectly, right?
And to be honest,
Oh, John's disappeared. Are we going to get John back or not? I don't think we are going to get John back for a moment. He'll probably unglitch.
I mean, he was about to be honest. So I have no idea what that's about.
Somewhere on the audio feed, this conversation is going ahead without us, or else there'll be somebody screaming in the background, "Can you hear me? Can you hear me?" So
that's going to get awkward.
Well, that's going to be an edit point that I'm going to have to sort out on the audio version for next week, isn't it?
That's fine then.
In the meantime, I don't know. Should we wait for it?
There you go.
Oh, he's back.
Sorry, Skype crashed on me for some reason. Skype crashed on me. I'm gonna have to look at it and see what it does. What's doing that for?
You were about to be honest, John.
Yeah, well, it's a rarity, I'll tell you. I mean, it's one of the great things about the Blu-ray sets for me. I got that back. I got that back. It's one of my least favorite series of the classic run, and I got it back and watched it, and I actually found myself enjoying it a lot more, just for I suppose, for the care that's been put into those sets, for all the material surrounding them as well. It was just it makes you look at it in that slightly more favorable light, I think.
And then sometimes there's this thing we do as fans of this program that we've seen over and over and over again for years and years and years, right? And some of the stories we've watched less often because they're our, least favorites. So when we come to revisit them, they're the ones that are fresher. But also at the same time, I think a lot of the times, and Matt will know what I'm talking about when I say this, we watch it archaeologically. So we watch it not because we're watching the stories, not because we're watching it for necessarily whether the writing is any good or the acting is any good, but we're watching it because we have a fondness for the characters, and we have a fondness for the actors, and we have a fondness for the people who made it. Even if they're people we don't like, we still have a fondness for them, right? Everybody knows I'm not a fan of Eric Sayward, and yet the weird thing is I'm really fond of Eric Sayward because, he's Eric Sayward, who was the script editor on Doctor Who for 5 years. And so I will happily, watch Eric. There's very, very few Doctor Who stories that I couldn't put on for pleasure, even if they're stories I don't like, because even when you don't like it, you still have this fondness for it, and you watch it because of the fondness rather than because of the actual thing that you're watching.
And in archaeological terms, this season is the one which really was worth getting on DVD because of the extras, because of the documentaries. If they had an Adventure in Space and Time sequel set somewhere else in Doctor Who, this would be a perfect story to tell because of what's happening behind the scenes. Having said that, I enjoyed it on broadcast. I do have to put the pin in the ground that there's an awful lot of dog poo in these stories, so I'm not blind to that.
I think before we go in, let's go in now. But before we go in, I think, and I'm pretty sure I talked about something along these lines when we did the Trial of a Time Lord last time. I think all 4 stories basically have sound ideas, but they're sound ideas that don't really quite gel or aren't really thought through or aren't really made to sort of become a consistent whole. So, for instance, the Mysterious Planet, the stuff with Katrika and the stuff with Glitz and Dipper, they just don't go together. So and the stuff, underground with the robot just doesn't go together with either of those things. So all those elements of the story end up sort of talking about all the other elements of the story, but they never quite feel like they're elements of the same story. So nothing quite feels consistent throughout the whole year. And I think the sort of interventions when you go to the trial every 5 minutes or whatever it is just ends up undermining that even more, so that nothing feels consistent at all. It's just this real sort of hodgepodge of all sorts of different things, and it's almost like watching some, the Disney Time programs where they used to have somebody introducing clips from Disney films, and every 5 minutes you'd go to a different movie, right? And when you do that, that's fine because somebody's introducing it, and when they introduce a new clip, you reset and you're watching something that's entirely divorced from the clip you've watched just now. In this, every time you go to the trial, it's almost like that, where the trial is introducing this new clip that's got nothing whatsoever to do with the thing you just watched. And it's like every 5 minutes through each of these episodes, you're sort of resetting your brain, trying to sort of recalibrate to make the thing add up. I don't know, that's just kind of how it felt to me when I watch it back, how it feels to me, just like...
Yeah.
And if it... Sorry, John.
No, I was going. There are a lot of these trial scenes which are just going back to the trial for the sake of going back to the trial. They don't change the story at all. And if you're going back to the trial to break that story, that's what you need. It's not just Colin Baker and Michael Jaston shouting each other across the courtroom.
Yeah, calling each other names.
We've always been really pleased that Doctor Who hasn't been on ITV because you don't get advert breaks. But actually, Trial of a Time Lord, that's what they are.
That's what it feels like, yeah.
And they're written by, they feel like they're written by somebody who's not writing the stories, who's just looking for slots to fit in these scenes to justify it. which
This
is
is
what
the-
I was saying. If they had a sort of a queue situation of the trial actually taking place within what's happening, so mysterious ghost figures turning up or something, anything to get them out of the big studio set.
Well, this is one of the things they say about drama writing, isn't it? You've got to look at every single scene in your screenplay, in your script, in your play, and you've got to look at every single scene and say, what does this scene do? What does it achieve? Where does it push people on to? How are the characters changed by the end of it? How has the plot moved on by the end of it? And the trouble with the Trial of the Time Lord is all of those questions, the answer throughout all of those trial scenes is, I don't know. It does nothing. So we talk about what came forth then. On 33.3%, so with 1/3 of the points it could have accumulated, and that's pretty good for a story that's come forth. I think this is the highest bottom placed story we've had, and although that's because there are only 4 stories, we have done several series of only 4 stories, so it's done pretty well for itself. You can guess what it is, right?
I'm thinking Mind Warp.
Will Elliott votes it 4th and says, and then he puts, the cat walked across my keyboard, but I couldn't have summed it up better myself. Alistair Thwaite votes it 3rd and says, mostly shouting and colours and nonsense. And Steve Herr votes it 2nd. Mostly shouting and lots of darkness and nonsense. Steve Herr votes it 2nd and says the ending was chilling and horrific, but also amazing. They should not have cheapened it 2 stories later and let Nicola Bryant exit with some of the best actings. They should not have cheapened it 2 stories later. They should have let Nicola Bryant exit with some of the best acting seen in the classic series. On that note, I don't think changing it later cheapens it, because at the moment of broadcast, the impact is there. And I'll always say this, you can change things afterwards, but that doesn't alter the emotional weight of the thing that's happening as it's happening earlier on. So for me, I don't mind that they sort of marry her off at the end of the series. I think the ending of that episode still works. But Mind Warp, John, what are your feelings about Mind Warp?
That's quite summed up quite nicely. I mean, you've got Brian Blessed, and that's never a bad thing. You're always going to have some form of entertainment on there. But again, I've got this thing about Philip Martin, that he is undoubtedly a brilliant writer, but his tone is too, I don't know, I want to say sort of almost sickish.
It's Watershed.
Yes, it's absolutely, it's gangsters, it's that he wants that right for that audience. Yeah. It's not what, you can see why the BBC went, why are we putting this out at tea time on a Saturday? Because as a kid, as I said, that scene that my gran was talking about, the scene with Perry, and you go, that's genuinely going to upset some people there. And there is, I think there's a Stephen Moffat quote that the story is Doctor Who looks after his companions. I know Stephen Moffat is a sentimental writer, but yes, and you've killed, and when the companion's off a few years earlier, it won't have that same impact again anyway. The Undoing, I don't mind it. It is kind of a bit cheap. It's kind of done quite almost perfunctorily, but what you're going to do, and in having to wrap up, Pip and Jane Baker come in and go, I have to wrap this up in 30 minutes. But back to my work, yeah. The coloring as well. It's, yes, I understand you're making it an alien world there, but it's just, you almost want to put sunglasses on for that, don't you? On Thoros Beta. Nabil Shaban, obviously, he's really good value again.
Patrick Ryckart as well, I think, is a fantastic actor. Oh,
that sip of tea he does just before the operation is fabulous. It's just a lovely little bit of business on that. Yeah. So yeah, you've got the actors there, but I just think the tone and the script, it's all kind of wrong for Doctor Who.
Yeah. And of course, going back to a comment that people made earlier, the fact is you've got the Doctor doing this stuff, and yet nobody ever at any point during the course of the story, even afterwards, they come back and they change what happens with Nicola Bryant. They don't change what happens with the Doctor. What is his motivation for his behaviour in this story? We never do find out.
Well, they didn't even find out on set, did they? Because I think there's a story
No.
of Colin Baker going to Eric Saywood. He said, "Ask Philip Martin." Philip Martin said, "Ask Eric Saywood."
Yeah,
So
it's crazy. Matt, Mind Warp.
I mean, I liked it when it was on, because it was a good series of set pieces. It was good to have Syl back. I remembered Syl from the year before. I think I quite like the Thoris Beta look. The use of, what is it, Quantel, to change everything about a beach so it stops looking like a beach. I think that was quite successful, quite kind of memorable. I mean, they did it more subtly in Survival a few years later, and I think that was better. But this was more of a kind of a Quantel splurge.
I think the trouble with it is it looks like a special effect. So you're never at any point under any illusion that you're watching something and that's fair enough, but you don't want it to be quite so obvious as it was here, I think.
But again, at the time, and maybe it was just my age.
Yeah.
It didn't feel like I was looking at a David Bowie video.
Yeah.
which is kind of where it comes from.
absolutely.
But again, I remember being more scared. I think there are moments which are really scary in this. Is this the one where Perry turns into a bird, or is that Vengeance on Varos?
Varos. That's
Varos,
yeah.
Okay.
Bird is the first time. This one is something else.
So I remember her turning into a bird in not this story.
Yeah.
So obviously, yeah, I must have remembered her dying at the end of this. I don't mind the reversal of the dying Perry. Like John, I mind the way they did it.
Yeah.
Felt again like a different writer had just slotted something in. And
the trouble is as well is they didn't have Nicola Bryant available to them to record anything for that, so they were at a bit of a loss as to how else to do it, I suppose.
And normally when they fix things like that, they fix it a few years later, or they don't normally fix something in a story virtually as the story's being made. I mean, this is really a season where they're obviously making it on the hoof, and one of the commenters said it's like Flux. They're obviously changing it and improvising and coming up with it. But Flux, Chibnall gets away with. Here, they just don't get away with it. It feels like you can tell when it flips from one writer to another, when another writer's brought in to complete one story and another. This story, Mind Warps, should be the most coherent and consistent because it's not written by somebody who's dying. It's not completed by somebody else. It's not written by the bakers who can't really write and who have been brought in to write an emergency story. This is written by Philip Martin, who's writing a sequel. This should be the strongest, most consistent story.
Should be, yeah.
But this is one place where the Trial of a Time Lord does kind of really warp the stories that have been churned into it, because, as you say, the Doctor just starts acting completely illogically. We get the feeling that something weird's going on, but the explanation presumably dies with Robert Holmes. So we'll never know.
I remember when I did come to watch this, I can't remember how long after the fact it was, but I don't think it was too long, because, like I say, I'd come in at Terror of the Vervoids and actually found myself enjoying it more than I expected to. So I went back to the first two stories relatively soon thereafter, and I can remember starting this one and thinking, oh, actually, this is really good. And for about, I don't know, half the first episode, I'm sure I sat down and watched it all in one go, obviously, because it was after the fact. So I don't know for how long, maybe for about 30 or 40 minutes. I was thinking, well, actually, Patrick Rycart, I love Patrick Rycart. He's fantastic. Brian Blessed, I don't think he's right for Doctor Who, and he certainly doesn't fit in this story, but he's watchable. And I don't know, the relationship between the Doctor and Perry is much better at this stage, so that felt better too. But yeah, it got to a point, and I don't know, I don't think it was actually that far into the story. It got to a point where I just thought, what's going on? Who cares about what's going on? There was this stuff quite early that was where it started to tip, where they sort of meet this werewolf thing in a cave, right?
Oh,
and it's filmed, it's filmed in such a way that you can't even see it.
I think that's a large part of it is Ron Jones, being the director. He is shall we say, he is not the best director. He's in that sort of just point and shoot thing. There's no
Yeah.
flair to it. There's no bank system, which maybe, you know, at this point Doctor Who needs. It's that JNT is just hiring. I know he's hiring the old directors out of loyalty, out of, you know, he doesn't want to see them just fizzle out and fade away. But you need, you know, not necessarily Graham Harper himself, but someone with that sort of flair, someone who's in on the modern day way of moving the cameras, of doing more than just look, you know, the theatrical method of production. Or
Yeah.
you know,
Well, those bits in the cave could have been really eerie and really spooky. But as it was just like somebody had pointed a camera into a corner of the studio where they'd forgot to put the lights on at all. And that was the point at which I started to think, something's going wrong here. And then when the Doctor starts behaving out of character and everything else, and then you start getting, oh, this is going to be another story where they experiment on Perry, just like the last time Philip Martin wrote. And, you know, this story went on a very heavy downhill trajectory the further into it I got. Matt, sorry, go on.
It's kind of I was going to say, Ron Jones, who directed Black Orchid, you cannot criticize Ron Jones. Admittedly, he directed Time Flight as well, and Arc of Infinity. But
he's good on location. He's terrible in the studio.
yes,
I was thinking it's kind of testament to how ham-fisted Colin Baker's Doctor was characterized in his first few stories, that this feels like a kind of a callback to how he was when he started. So watching this, you sort of think, well, this is just old school Colin Baker Doctor, old school Sixth Doctor, rather than what's happened to the beloved Sixth Doctor.
Yeah.
So there's
been
that,
there, seen that, done that.
There's that layer of confusion as well.
Yeah, you're not wrong, because this is just Trial of a Time Lord. I mean, Trial of a Time Lord is just a twin dilemma, sorry.
Yeah.
Hell, there's me confusing the names of them, let alone the stories themselves. Shall we move on to...
Yes.
In third place, 47.9%, Will Elliott votes it first. His reason for voting it first, at least it's short, of 47.9%, is The Ultimate Foe. I think this is probably this is not great. I think it's probably underrated for reasons that you talked about earlier, I guess, John. I don't think it's great, but I do think there's a lot of good things in this. How do you feel about it, John?
I think it's a miracle that it's actually as coherent as it is, because obviously not to advertise myself and Matt, you know, again, but you know, the Black Archive on it by Jim Curry Smith is superb on outlining exactly what happened with it, how much of it is Robert Holmes, how much of it is Eric Saywood, and then exactly what the Bakers had to work with at the end of it. I mean, the Bakers, you know, they came in with that brief for episode 14. This is where we leave it. We can't show you anything else, you know, so you have to come up with this over a weekend and have it fit into Doctor Who's time slot. Yeah, it's not the epic conclusion they wanted. I love the, you know, the Robert Holmes settings of it, the obvious, the fantasy factory, for instance.
Yeah.
That's great. And this is Jeffrey Hinsliff, I think, isn't it?
Jeffrey Hughes.
Thank you. I mean, he's great, and the surrealism is great. But obviously, if you're going to be surreal, you almost need a payoff there. And episode 14 kind of doesn't really pay that off. I admire the Bakers for actually getting as close to it, even with the you know, the terrible the terror of the megabyte modem. You know?
Yeah. Well,
that aged badly.
But that's just the bubble wrap from Ark in Space again, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Catharsis of spurious morality.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't mind dialogue like that. I think.
No, I'm fine.
I mean, you go back and read. Go back and read Chaucer, and if you read, well, we talked about Shakespeare recently. You can't say Shakespeare's dialogue. No, I don't think it's that far removed from, you know, but the point I was about to
headline: J.R. Southall, Pip and Jane Baker are as good as Shakespeare.
Yeah.
It's going to be on Sci-Fi Bulletin.
I'm not entirely sure that's quite what I was saying, but you know what I mean.
But they're up there with Chaucer, in that
but
no
the
one's
point-
been able to decode it for
Well,
8 centuries.
Depends which bit of Chaucer. The point I was going to make, though, is they sat Pip and Jane Baker down and they said, you've got 48, 72 hours to come up with a script. Here's the first half of the story. That wasn't enough. They didn't just need the first half of the story. They needed a copy of Deadly Assassin on video. They needed a copy of the War Games so they could see the last time the Doctor was on trial and the context that was around it. They needed all the context of the background of the previous 20 years of Doctor Who, and they needed to know which bits were important, because this whole idea of the Doctor being on trial doesn't just refer back to the start of the Doctor being on trial in episode 1 of The Mysterious Planet. This is a story that's kind of been bubbling away in the background of Doctor Who for years. Whenever John Pertwee gets sent on missions for the time, well, the fact that John Pertwee is sentenced to be on Earth, that's part of the story that we're having here. Even things like Arc of Infinity, this story is referring back even to stuff like that. These are all the things that Pip and Jane Baker needed to know about. They needed to have 24 hours just watching videos of particular stories that are important to this plot, to this narrative, before they even sit down and read the script for the first half of the story, so that they can come up with something in the second half that doesn't just complete this story, but ties up all these threads that have been bubbling away in Doctor Who for decades. And of course, it doesn't do any of those things. And it probably wouldn't have done so many of those things, even in the Eric Saywood version. But at least the Eric Saywood version makes it about the Doctor and the Master, and makes it about the Time Lords in a way that Pip and Jane Baker are never really quite going to, are they?
No, I will say that the actual ending of the trial is probably better for the series than the Saywood ending would have been.
Oh yes,
which is,
I hated that.
It's terrible. I know it was. I remember when, when I first came into fandom for years, this was all built up as a wonderful ending. You know, the Doctor and the Valiard locked in eternal combat, falling through, and you go, no, because then you get the chance for the the sixth floor to go. Fair enough, we can just leave it there, can't we?
Well, and even so, I just think that's a terrible way to end a season anyway.
Yeah.
It's only a decent ending to a season if you know what your first episode of the next season is going to be, because that's a mid plot cliffhanger. If you know how the plot resolves, you can leave it on a cliffhanger like that. But they were going to leave it on a cliffhanger like that for the sake of the cliffhanger, and that's the bit that for me says no, these guys have got no clue, because that is just leaving the problem for somebody else.
And you've had 14 episodes and you leave it on a cliffhanger.
And you've had 18 months to think this up. You know?
Yeah, I mean, the other thing you come back to is they had how many stories ready to go beforehand? It's like, why were those stories abandoned? I mean, with certain of them, I can see why they're abandoned, because they are terrible, worse than anything we got. But yeah,
but even so, Terror of the Vervoids has been written at the very last minute, basically, and they've had 18 months to get this season together. So why are things coming in this late? You're right.
So there's a suggestion that the production team, the head of the production team, were taking their eyes off the ball for various reasons. I'm surprised that Ultimate. I always assumed that Ultimate Foe was actually quite highly rated in this season because of the episode 13, because of the surrealism. So when I was growing up and engaging, or not engaging, reading Doctor Who magazine, Ultimate Foe was always quite highly placed. So obviously it sort of slipped. I think Pip and Jane Baker, yes, they're brought in at the last minute. Yes, they've written it over a weekend. Presumably, it sounds like they had Ian Levine possibly somewhere on tap, supplying them with background information to help them flesh it out. But
I'm not sure. I think even Levine was gone at this point, wasn't he?
I think I thought he was gone by then. Yeah,
I think so.
There seems to have been maybe not Eric Saywood, he was old.
Maybe somebody from the magazine. Who knows?
But Douglas Adams did the same thing with City of Death. The difference being Douglas Adams can write witty dialogue that glosses over any plot holes. I mean, City of Death, the whole thing about the artist painting the fractured Romana, that doesn't make sense. That makes as much sense as anything in Ultimate Foe, but you don't care about it because you've got Tom Baker acting his socks off through it, and you've got Douglas Adams' dialogue over it. If Pip and Jane Baker were quite, and I'm normally quite charitable. I'm normally quite positive about writers, but Pip and Jane Baker, I don't think are good writers. Normally, you'd say yes, but they know how to produce 22 tight minutes of drama packaged solidly and structured. This is 30 minutes. They produced an episode that overran, so they didn't even have that going for them. But I really like this. This is still one of my favorites because it's got atmosphere and because it's got the surrealism. It's got that amazing cliffhanger of him being pulled into the sand. It's got the hands coming out of the barrel, and so I like both. Yeah. I like both episodes. But you can tell. You can tell when the dialogue slips. You can just tell. It's not good dialogue. It's really awful.
And of course, the big difference between this and City of Death is self-contained, whereas this has to relate back across 13 episodes of TV that were written by other people. Well, I mean, mostly written by other people. Let's talk about the story that comes in second. And now you're going to get a chance to talk about the one you wanted to talk about, Matt. On 54.2%, Stu Gutteridge votes this third, says the Dr. Perry relationship is excellent, great use of locations, glitz is a welcome addition. I think he's right on all those things, but Will Elliott says Bob Holmes deserves a better send-off. He votes it second, actually. Mysterious Planet. So many great things in this, and yet it just feels like weak sauce. I don't know, John.
It's you get that opening shot. I think there's an infamous thing they showed this at this was the weekend of the Panopticon convention, and they saw this opening shot, and everyone's going wow. And then you get to a story, you're back to your your little sort of woods and countryside, and there's nothing in the actual story to make you go wow after that opening shot. I mean, we Robert Holmes, he is obviously one of the best writers to write for Who in terms of what he brings, the humor, the almost a story up to the end, because you can never end a story. It's always an explosion. But it feels like Robert Holmes is running on empty, and as we know, he was later on.
This is Robert Holmes of Power of Kroll, not the Robert Holmes of Power of Kroll or the Sunmakers. This is Robert Holmes when he's tapped out and he's the assistant comes back and does more, and he's like, I've done it all.
It's have you got any ideas, Bob? What's at the back of the drawer? I'll just try this.
There's some good stuff. He's crashed again.
So I'm going to take the opportunity to disagree. I think yes, the opening effects shot is cracking. I think the trial sequences is where it falls flat. But actually, the opening episode of this, I love the location stuff. I love the idea of the underground station, the tube station, Marble Arch, suddenly appearing. I mean, it's what they didn't do with Orphan 55 that they were trying to do, because they stupidly set Orphan 55 in Siberia, which doesn't work at all. This absolutely works. It's an amazing concept. And it doesn't have time in that first episode to run out of gas or to fall over, because it's setting things up really well. I think you can see desperately, depressingly, you can see Robert Holmes flagging, but I think he starts flagging after episode 1. I think episode 1 is good, and then he falls over.
John's coming back. I don't disagree. I think you're right. The first episode is far and away ahead of the other 3 in terms of how coherent it feels, but I do think it just feels, and I think the OB cameras that they're using probably has something to do with this. That first episode, it feels like the Doctor Who team's gone out on a bit of a jolly, and they're sort of maybe it feels like they're rehearsing a Doctor Who story rather than making a Doctor Who story. And it never really quite feels like it's the takes that should have made it to the screen. So the first episode feels like a really well written episode, and it tails off very quickly thereafter. A bit like Mind Warp, goes downhill fast. into some great ideas that, just like I said earlier in the podcast, I don't feel cohere with the rest of it. But yeah, that first one, all the stuff with Glitz and Dibber is just so, stand by that tree and I'll point a camera at you. Don't move, because I can't move the camera. And it just feels like they're rehearsing rather than actually making a television program.
I guess it could be early days with outside broadcast like that still. I mean, it's been going, obviously they've been doing it for a while, but it's still sort of, because the year before, 2 years before, Marco Durrani was definitely film on location
Ironbridge, yeah.
video. Yeah. So this is the difference. They've kind of taken these other cameras outside.
Well, the only time they'd used OB cameras before was in Robarts. I don't think they'd used them since, unless I'm mistaken.
Sontaran experiment.
Oh yes, Sontaran.
Yes, entirely.
Season 12 though, yeah. Because Robot, they were filming all the outdoor stuff in Robot. It's not actually on location. It's just at the back of the studio, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes. So there is that. John, you disappeared. Were you saying something when you disappeared again?
I probably wasn't. I've forgotten exactly what I was saying now because I was listening.
Well, we don't care anyway, because
no,
Matt only cares about what Matt's saying, and I only
absolutely.
care about what I'm saying. You're only here to give somebody to have at the other side
referee
of
it.
I cared about what John was saying because I was disagreeing with him, and I managed to disagree with him when he was completely offline. So there's about 3 minutes worth of invective from me going, John was wrong when he said this.
I think the thing about The Mysterious Planet is, of all the stories in the season, it has the capacity to feel the most like a classic Doctor Who story, and it's got all the elements to make a brilliant sort of Hinchcliffe Holmes era Doctor Who story, and yet it just looks like, I tell you what, it looks like a colour version of a really cheaply made, very early William Hartnell story like The Censorites. It's like Talent of Weng Chiang done on the budget and with the resources of the Censorites.
In fact, it's like The Savages. So it starts out with a bunch of good location filming or location stuff in the first episode, and then before long they've gone into a very, very boring series of corridors in the studio, and that's when this really kind of.
I quite like a lot of the characters, but again, do you know? And you know, I love Kubrick and the Coens, and they create characters and they create a universe that really coheres. The Mysterious Planet is filled with great characters, but none of them are from the same television program as each other. None of them feel like they're from the same universe as each other, and you just can't feel the storylines relating with each other. So this is, for me, this is really an example of lots of great ideas that just absolutely have got nothing to do with each other.
And the other thing is, it doesn't properly get resolved until episode 14 again. Yeah. So
yes, it sets up this mystery that's so obvious that you should be able to resolve it here, because there's no mystery about what the mystery is, and yet they're just kind of
It's framed in such a way that for ages I didn't realize that there was a mystery.
Yes.
So I'm watching it thinking, well, this is all explained.
Yeah.
And there's no mystery here. It's all been explained happily. And it's only when you get to the end, then they go, aha.
This is
you
what
might
we
not
did.
have noticed there's a mystery that we didn't talk about from the first. Well, okay.
Yeah. And that's the problem. There's no real tension in getting to that end of the 4 episodes.
That's exactly the word I was about to use, because if that mystery had been addressed at the end of episode 4, then the Valeyard and the Doctor would have had a tension in that each has got one up on the other and who's going to get the upper hand. But as it is, the rest of the story is just the Valeyard putting the Doctor down and the Doctor just bellowing but not really having any comeback. And yet here's his perfect comeback, right? And yet it never really sort of manifests. Shall we talk about the story that won then?
I wonder what it could be.
On 64.6%. So, it's about 10% in front, but given that there's only 4 stories, that could have been 25%. Will Elliott says Robots of Death did it much better and votes it third. Stu Gutteridge says Mel is a breath of fresh air and it's a simple story told well, and he votes it first. Simple story told well, it's a simple story. It's told reasonably. I think Terror of the Vervoids has got some great moments. As I said earlier, the cliffhangers are brilliant. And some of the stuff on the spaceship is fantastic. Some of the other stuff on the spaceship, not so much. You know, it's an Agatha Christie in space thing. And one of the things about Agatha Christie's stories is that there's a kind of comfort in the characters and in the interaction between the characters, while at the same time, murder's taking place, right? So it's got this really nasty edge, but also this really comfortable tone. And I think Terror of the Vervoids, more through luck than judgment, manages to balance some really nasty stuff. Those cliffhangers with the Vervoids, with this sort of really comfortable tone with these characters. It's just a really odd mixture that I think works better than it probably ought to, because I think Terror of the Vervoids is a story with masses of faults, but there's actually quite pleasant to watch. John, what do you think about? Yeah,
it's the one that feels most like past Doctor Who, doesn't it? Because you've had this kind of thing with the robots of death. I mean,
everything going back to the censor rights. It's the same story as the censor rights.
It's a really, really nicely sort of structured story. You know, it's not anything that's, you know, avant-garde in here at all, bar possibly Baker's dialogue. But it's just it's that familiarity of the structure, and Bonnie Langford does bring a different energy to the series than Nicola Bryant. And there's not to put Nicola Bryant down, but it feels more, there's more get up and go to it than there was, you know, just one episode earlier. It's more enjoyable. Yeah, fundamentally what you were saying, it's just more enjoyable to watch than Mind Warp, than Mysterious Planet.
Yes, after 8 episodes of Perry's bottom lip quivering and her voice going like this every time she talks because she's got this nervous energy, you really needed something different. And finally we had it. Matt, Terror of the Vervoids. You're not going to like this one, surely.
No, I do. I quite like. I mean, I agree with everything you've said. I think Pip and Jane Baker are good at writing, kind of like Terrence Dicks. They're good at scaffolding for stories.
Yeah.
They're good at writing stories that hit moments of tension at the right time. The cliffhangers are good. The whodunits, fine. It's not quite as, I mean, in some ways it's more sophisticated than Robots of Death. Robots of Death, the culprit is revealed because they've basically bumped off everybody else it could be, and then they invent a backstory at the last minute. So in some ways, at least this has a twist that Robots of Death doesn't. It's also got a sort of a strange, a particular atmosphere. So Robots of Death had that kind of Art Deco look. This has something similar, not Art Deco, but the
80s habitat.
Yeah, but it does feel like a coherent spaceship to me, and it might just be from watching it when I was young, but it feels like the limitations of the sets for this year. So what didn't work in Mysterious Planet, what doesn't work in the trial scenes, kind of works on a sort of a Starliner, luxury Starliner, because everything feels bland, but it's kind of offset by the organic, creepy Vervoids and the sort of things happening underneath and the hydroponic section. That all kind of works in its favor, I think.
In some ways, it kind of looks better than the Ark in Space, even. I've always thought the Ark in Space looks a bit too bland. This kind of does something similar from a different angle, but I think the direction's good. I think the design is good. I particularly like the vaginal Vervoids. I think they're very effective. Seminal moments from my childhood. Did you mean to say vegetable? Because
dialogue, the dialogue's still not good. But at least this is the one where the Doctor has a weird relationship with the ship's captain. But he knows his nickname,
the Commodore
Tonka Travers.
I quite like that, because that's so unlike. That's completely from. I mean, that's pretty much from What on Earth or whatever Pip and Jane were doing outside of Doctor Who. They've just decided to just sort of impose this completely new personality on the Sixth Doctor, and because it's supposed to be in the future in a sort of a twisty way, that kind of works. You get the feeling that Colin Baker is playing a sort of a future softened version of the Doctor, who's travelled with Mel for a while and is being slowly ground down by her relentlessness. So yeah, I think this is fine. I don't think this is the most interesting of the season. I don't think this is the best of the season, but I think the votes were probably about right to sort of squish all of them up somewhere in the middle. In some ways, this is the most consistent season of Doctor Who that there is. It's just that it's in terms of its bell curve, the peak is slightly below the 50% in quality than above it. So yeah, I'm fine with it.
Yeah, I mean the thing about Vervoid as well, it's what we were saying about the world earlier. It's what Pip and Jane Baker do that maybe other writers of the time didn't. Is that it actually, you can believe human beings exist in this environment, because you've got the gym there, you've got the laundry, you've got that lounge. It's somewhere you have people actually and people have relationships, like the Doctor having that relationship with Travers. It's it's actually convincing in a way that isn't pure science fiction.
Yes, it feels like well, I mean, it obviously doesn't look like one, but it feels like a more consistent, real lived-in universe than you generally get in Doctor Who, which again is something it shares with Robots of Death, because that did too, and it's something that a lot of writers seem to forget to do, or did. Back then, at least, yeah.
It kind of exposes something that's missing from this season of Doctor Who, and that's Earth. There are no kind of stories set in Earth's past or contemporary Earth. They're all set off-world. This is as close as it comes to sort of being on Earth.
Spoilers.
Of course, the mysterious planet map, but it's what
it is.
Yeah.
But
it's no essentially an alien version of
contemporary Earth or Earth's past. So mysterious planet is Earth's future, presumably, unless there's some sort of mysterious timey-wimey thing going on.
Who knows? But yeah, it's a season where all 14 episodes, all 4 stories are kind of divorced from anything that matters to the people who are watching it.
Yeah, there's no 2 Doctors, there's no Attack of the Cybermen here. It's all sort of...
There's no relatable peril.
There's no Mark of the Rani.
Yeah. There's no relatable...
And Terror of the Voivoids is as close as it comes to this, because they are clearly recognisably human people, human characters. This could be set in the Britas Empire. This could be set in a leisure centre somewhere quite easily.
Yeah, sure. Or it's a cruise, isn't it? It's a cruise ship.
Yeah.
It's Voyage of the Damned, basically.
Or any Troughton Base Under Siege you want.
Anything more to add about Trial of a Time Lord then? Now that we've talked through it,
is this the one that's? Oh yeah, no, this has come out on Blu-ray, hasn't it?
Season 22 so is the one
22.
This is the one I gritted. One of the few that I gritted my teeth to pre-order and buy on Blu-ray, because I've already got the special features that I wanted. But I'm glad they got it out of the way.
John, any thoughts that occur to you now?
I just think it's never going to escape that feeling that the behind the scenes dramas are far more interesting than what we actually got on screen from them. It's always going to be overshadowed by that Eric Saywood walking out, and Robert Holmes dying. It's again, I think, as we said earlier, it's Doctor that's more interesting archaeologically than for what we actually get on screen.
Are we going to take sides in this? Was Eric Saywood right to say, this is my artistic vision, if you're not having it, I'm walking away? Or was John Nathan Turner right to say, this is a professional production, we can't do this stuff for a tea time audience?
I think bringing it back to what John was saying at the beginning, that, or maybe it was JR, that there wasn't enough difference. I think JR was saying there's not enough difference in this season compared to the last one. Oh, you both were saying it, because John was saying
John said
they thought they were going to get rid of the nastiness and didn't, and then JR was saying you looked at the people making it and it hadn't changed.
Yes,
I think Eric Saywood is the person that stands out as being the person who should have left before this series, and obviously, if it hadn't have been a kind of kick bollock scramble to get it made, maybe there would have been. But they still had 14 months to sort of prepare for this. Eric Saywood, they should have got a different script editor, and
You
they
just
should
look
got,
at,
you know,
you look
somebody.
at, I mean, for all the world that it's still written by Pip and Jane Baker, you look at Time and the Rani, that is so radically different from this that you think if that had been on in this slot, people would have said, yeah, they've done something with Doctor Who. At least they've made an effort. This didn't feel like they'd made an effort.
Yeah, and I think there's a problem that Eric Saywood, God bless him, but he is probably the least well-suited script editor to the job that Doctor Who ever had. You know, the structure of the stories is all over the show. You know, they don't have good endings. There's almost no dramatic satisfaction. You know, strands of story don't talk to each other, which is a problem right from Earthshock up to now. So
they all talked about the fact that they'd been told to change the tone of the program, but not what they should change the tone to, or how they should change it. If you're a television professional, you don't necessarily need to be told what you should be doing. If they say change the tone of something, you should be able to do it.
Well, that's Andrew Cartmel walks in, you know, he says, what do you want to do? We want to bring down the government. Fair enough. There you go. He's got an idea.
Yeah, I'd go further. If you're a script editor and you're told they want you to change the program, they're not going to tell you what to change it. That's like a gift.
Yes.
That's what you want. You don't want Michael Grade to come in and say, right, we want you to bring K9 back. We want it to be lighter and breezier, and we want this line and this line. You just want to, you know, just be told. Make it
surely
different.
as well, and surely as well, you don't just want somebody every year saying to you, "Same again, please," because that surely is going to get dull, isn't it?
Yeah, unless you're Barry Letts. Yeah.
I think, wasn't it? Jonathan Pell did actually give notes on the first episode of Mysterious Planet, and that was famously dispiriting for Robert Holmes.
Yes,
that's Eric Saywood's job, to protect him, you know, to be that sort of guy in the middle, not just go, Rob, do you know, have these?
Yeah, the notes.
Yeah.
John, then, have you enjoyed your first full outing on a Doctor Who themed Strangers in Space?
I've thoroughly enjoyed it, even if I'm don't particularly enjoy the stories.
Well, fair
you've
enough.
been fabulous company, even Matt when he's disagreeing with me.
Oh, you didn't hear me. You didn't have to listen back.
Yeah.
You can come back then, John.
Although
maybe not necessarily next time. We'll have to see.
Particularly as you've signed the dislike Eric Saywood clause in the contract. In blood.
Damn it, Matt, I just did my segue into the next bit I was going to say and you've stepped all over it. Excellent. Next time, in a fortnight, because I'm going to have to miss a week, we're coming back to do Modern Series 9, Peter Capaldi's middle series. Okay. And then after that, we've only got one more poll to go, which is season 14. So that'll be turning up. Well, in fact, all things being equal, that will be on our Facebook page by the time this episode goes out.
Man.
Perhaps not on video, but very close after. What's up with that?
That means we're going to be talking about Talons of Wayne Chiang and getting into trouble on the internet.
Will we get into trouble?
Matt's looking forward to this.
I don't think it's a conversation that's happened so many times.
Yeah.
Anyway, until these things happen, I was JR.
I was John.
And I was Matt.
And we will speak again soon.